This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. In August 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress to give him the authority to increase the U.S. military presence in Indochina. The immediate event that precipitated his request was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which two U.S. destroyers stationed in Vietnam reported that they had been fired on by the North Vietnamese forces. However, the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam stretched back to the early 1950s, and by the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson was already looking for an excuse to send more troops. Convinced that helping the South Vietnamese was the only way to prevent the spread of communism from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, which the U.S. feared would then spread throughout Asia. On August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted the president the right, quote, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed forces, unquote, both to defend U.S. forces and to protect South Vietnam in defense of its freedom, until such time when the president deemed that the area was secure. With that permission, Johnson sent a major contingent of U.S. Marines to Vietnam in 1965. And by 1968, over 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed there, with the effort costing the U.S. $77 billion a year. Over time, this lengthy Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular in the U.S. By 1960, 90% of U.S. households had televisions, up from just 9% in 1950. That made the Vietnam War the first televised war for the United States population. Images of death and destruction broadcast into American homes helped sway public opinion against the war. Anti-war protests began as early as 1966 and were especially big on college campuses where the students were of draft-eligible age. It wasn't just the American public who opposed the war, though. That opposition also existed within the military itself. In the early days of the war, that internal opposition was small and isolated, with individual service members being punished for attending anti-war demonstrations or refusing to fight. As the war and the opposition to war intensified, so did dissent within the ranks. At nearly every military base, anti-war GIs began publishing underground newspapers. There were even 2 underground GI newspapers published in the combat zone in Vietnam, the Boomerang Barb near Saigon in 1968, and GI Says near the DMZ in 1969. By 1972, there were an estimated 250 such underground newspapers on U.S. military bases around the world. Another way anti-war service members organized was in GI coffee houses. The first GI coffee house, named UFO, opened in January 1968 in Columbia, South Carolina, near Fort Jackson, one of the U.S. Army's largest training posts. The explicitly counterculture venue was so popular among the base's soldiers that over the next few years, more than 25 GI coffee houses opened near military bases, both in the U.S. and overseas. On March 15, 1971, the Haymarket Square Coffee House in Fayetteville, North Carolina, near what was then called Fort Bragg, hosted a new show, headlined by Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland, Peter Boyle, and Dick Gregory. Calling themselves the Free Theater Associates, or FTA, the group saw themselves as civilian supporters of the GI anti-war movement. Their work was funded in part by the Entertainment Industry for Peace and Justice, EIPJ, an organization founded by Fonda. The FTA had hoped to perform on the base, as USO shows did. And the United States Servicemen's Fund, USSF, made a formal request to the commander at Fort Bragg that was denied. The Haymarket Square Coffee House, meant to hold around 450 people, was packed with over 500 people per show over 3 shows, each paying the attendance fee of $2.50. Those funds went to the coffee house and the USSF. The performers themselves donated their time, and if they could afford it, their travel expenses. The show consisted of comedic sketches and explicitly political songs. In one popular skit, 2 of the performers acted as sportscasters, covering an imaginary battle. They ended with the declaration that the day's casualties were light to medium. Another popular segment of the show was their signature song, with FTA standing at first for Free the Army, but over the course of the song changing to F the Army, or the Air Force, Marines, or Navy, depending on the audience. As the show traveled across the country to other locations near, but never on, military bases, many of the skits and songs changed, and cast members rotated in and out, though Fonda and Sutherland remained on for the entire run. That November, FTA did a benefit performance at Lincoln Center in New York City for a civilian audience of 2,000 people before leaving for a tour of the Pacific Rim. On Thanksgiving Day 1971, the FTA tour played to a crowd of 4,000 in Honolulu, some 2,500 of whom were GIs. They followed that with huge shows in the Philippines, Japan, and Okinawa. During the Pacific tour, director Francine Parker filmed footage, both on stage and behind the scenes, along with interviews of active duty GIs. The resulting documentary, called simply FTA, was released in July 1972, but it stayed in theaters for only 1 week before its distributor, American International Pictures, pulled it from circulation and destroyed most of the copies of the film. It was re-released in 2009 and can now be purchased on DVD or Blu-ray or streamed on Apple TV and Canopy. Joining me now to help us understand more about the FTA is theater historian Dr. Lindsay Goss, assistant professor in the School of Theater, Film, and Media Arts at Temple University, and author of F the Army: How Soldiers and Civilians Staged the GI Movement to End the Vietnam War.
10 million soldiers to the war have gone, who may never return again. 10 million mothers' hearts must break for the one who died in vain. Heads bowed down in sorrow in her lonely years, I I heard a mother murmur through her tears, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dared to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Let nations of a race their future trouble. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes, I am so excited to have learned about this history that I thought I knew all kinds of stuff about the late 60s, early 70s. This was new to me. So tell me a little bit about how you first got onto this project. This book, I believe, comes out of your dissertation. So how did you get started on this?
It does come out of my dissertation, although it even earlier than that. In like the early 2000s, I was an anti-war activist in New York. And the Iraq Veterans Against the War, or Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans Against the War, was a relatively new organization. And I was involved in some organizing to support what they were doing. And there was a new film that had just come out, a documentary about the GI movement during the Vietnam War, which I had never heard anything about. But so there was like a fundraiser for IVAW where they were screening David Zeiger's film, Sir, No Sir, which is this documentary about that movement. And in that film, there are clips from the FTA film that show that show. And so this was the first time I knew anything about this anti-war variety show that played to active duty soldiers. And from there, it became a sort of a research project, a paper I wanted to write. And then eventually it became clear that there was a whole set of questions that I could explore through this one pretty short-lived theater event from 1971.
And so what are the kinds of sources then that you're able to use? I understand you interviewed some of the participants. What all are you able to pull together for this?
Well, the first thing that happened was that another grad student at Brown, who had been working on the GI movement, writing about it, sort of handed me this sheaf of photocopied articles that he had looked at when he was researching in Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I believe, from their archives on the GI movement. And he sort of gave me all of the ones that pertain to the FTA show. So that was sort of a starting point of really starting to piece together just how there had been this entire history of the show before the tour that there are clips of in Zeiger's documentary. And I started just piecing together, actually, this had a huge audience. Actually, it was wildly, it was really positively received by its audience. And I just wanted to sort of piece together that narrative. And then at a certain point, I started reaching out to people who had been involved. And it was one of these things where I got a hold of one person and they sort of directed me to another person and another person and another person. So it did sort of transform from this kind of archival material basis into this more oral history kind of basis. And then alongside that, a lot of what was informing the book sort of methodologically was my own experiences as an activist and trying to sort of think those through, what I was learning about this particular project from 71.
So I was looking at a New York Times review of the film when it came out in 72, and it said something like, by now everyone's heard of this Free Theater Associates. And I was like, okay, but nowadays nobody's heard of it. So what happened? Why did this become something that is really not very well known today?
Yeah, I think there's there's probably more than two answers to that question, but there's two that I think are helpful to understand. So one thing that happened is right after the film comes out in 72, it's pulled from theaters. And the director, Francine Parker, told David Zeiger that she believes it was because there was a call from the White House to Sam Arkoff, who is the head of AIP, the production company. So that's one thing, right? Like the film just sort of disappeared. Apparently, most copies were destroyed. And it really wasn't until David Zeiger remastered it and re-released it in the 2000s that it became available again. And the reason why he did that is because he wanted to include footage from FTA, the film, in his documentary, Sir, No Sir. And Francine Parker said, yes, you may, so long as you also remaster and re-release FTA itself. So they sort of came out around the same time as a result. So that's one piece of it. The film disappeared, and then that was the primary way in which people moving forward would access information about this show. And so that was not available. But I think for me, the more important answer to that question is that the GI movement was basically erased from our history and picture of resistance and protest in the 1970s. And I think that was quite intentional and deliberate. Even as it was happening, there were just continual efforts to say that it wasn't happening, that, there wasn't sort of hundreds of underground newspapers circulating, that there weren't soldiers participating in protests. And a big part of that is that, as soldiers were coming back, as veterans were sort of entering college or participating in protests, sometimes they stopped looking like veterans, right? They sort of could, merge with the kind of picture of the 1960s and 70s radical, especially like young radical students. And if you think about it, I mean, the idea that there were thousands of soldiers, more than that probably, in the military expressing resistance to it and organizing against the war, that's not necessarily something you want people broadly to be familiar with if you're invested in the military as an institution and in its projects. So I think the erasure of the GI movement is why the FTA also would not be something that registers. And it's also why Fonda's legacy could turn into a very anti-soldier one, because people are familiar with her anti-war activism that looks like her going to North Vietnam, but they're not familiar with what came before that, which was her extremely committed activism in support of the GI movement, of soldiers who were saying they were against the war.
And it wasn't just soldiers who'd been drafted, right? Like, this is a more widespread movement than that.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. There's an excellent book by David Courtwright called Soldiers in Revolt, which was actually, I think, his dissertation about the GI movement. I mean, this is from, I think it's published in the 70s, and then it was re-released later by Haymarket Books. But he is pointing out and showing statistically that in terms of the GI movement, it would be absolutely not the case that it was exclusively draftees. In fact, there was a real sense of betrayal on the part, especially of young people who had signed up to serve and then found that what they were being asked to do, on a pretty basic level didn't make any sense. Yeah, that there was a sense of betrayal there. And I remember that was a really important theme in the context of Iraq veterans against the war as well, that a lot of there's no draft, right? So they weren't drafted. But a lot of the conversation I remember was around this sense of betrayal, of finding out what exactly it is that you're being asked to do and in whose interests. And they're not yours, and they're not really the interests of anyone you know.
So what is the goal then of FTA? They want to support the GI movement, support the troops. What's their vision of how they're going to do that?
Yeah. So I think the vision transforms over the course of the life of the show, although, it retains sort of its starting vision, which initially they're sort of framing it as it's just entertainment. We want to show soldiers we're there for them, but that we're anti-war. It was in many ways conceived as a counter to the Bob Hope show, which was, a sort of patriotic, pretty much pro-war, even if most of the humor wasn't really about being pro-war. It's more about military life, enlisted life. Right. So it's initially conceived as kind of entertainment, anti-war entertainment for soldiers who are really only getting pro-war entertainment. And it's also, I think, a way for these celebrities, and Fonda in particular, to sort of use what they do to support this movement that they're aware of soldiers against the war. And one thing they emphasize really clearly early on that I think is related to the question you're asking is that they emphasize that they can't tell the soldiers anything they don't know. So their vision isn't that they're going and preaching to the soldiers about why they should be anti-war. Anything they're communicating to the soldiers is sort of a reflection back of what is already part of the sort of GI movement conversation. This took some really explicit forms, like taking material out of GI newspapers, right? So at a certain point, as they're touring in the US, there's a writer, Robin Minkin, who really starts to make a point of asking for copies of newspapers at a particular base to be sent to her so that she can write material based on what the soldiers actually are doing and thinking about and trying to protest or resist or whatever that may be. So there was this real sense that they are amplifying what the soldiers are already saying, and that amplification is both in service of growing the GI movement, right? So you probably have some audience members who are attending because Jane Fonda is going to be there and not because they're already particularly invested in the GI movement, but then who are hearing sort of through these celebrities the voices of their fellow soldiers about what's going on. So it's really interesting kind of, I don't know, circle or something of how this content is moving through the performers and through the audience. And then the other piece of it, I think, is that because you had celebrities involved, it was a way of then communicating to the civilian population that there were soldiers who were opposed to the war, right? So when there's coverage in newspapers of the FTA show, and especially the first show, so much of the coverage is about the audience and about how they're responding. And often there's a really great Village Voice article where there's interviews with soldiers afterwards about the show and about how they're opposed to the war. The film does that as well. So much of what we see is the soldiers. So I think fundamentally the show was about showing soldiers to themselves and about showing those soldiers to a civilian population.
So, logistically, unlike the Bob Hope show, they get no support from the military itself, never get to go onto a military base to do any of this. So, how are they able to then put together the tour first within the US and then they do this Pacific tour and get to soldiers without getting on bases?
Yeah, it was a big project. So there was already at this point the coffee house movement in the US and also abroad, where there were sort of radical or even just sort of hip off-base coffee houses, often run by civilian organizers or a combination of like veteran and civilian organizers that were meant to be spaces where soldiers could go away from kind of the scrutiny of the military and be around other soldiers who maybe were opposed to the war or maybe had, radical politics. And so that became the primary way they were able to access space. So sometimes it would be about performing at a coffee house, which is what happened with their first performance outside of Fort Bragg in Fayetteville, North Carolina. They performed at the Haymarket Coffee House. And these are not big spaces. So often there are multiple shows, people are packed in. But then there were shows in larger spaces or outdoor spaces. But generally, regardless of the specific space, whether it's an auditorium that they rent from the city, or whether it's a coffee house or, a park, the local coffee houses and the organizers involved in those, both civilians and soldiers and veterans, were basically the way they were able to organize these tours. So that's that mechanism there. It was way more complicated with the overseas tour. And I was so fortunate to get just this stack of correspondence from Elaine Ellenson, who was the advance person. So she went to all the places they were going to perform, reported back on the venues, reported back on local issues, and even just political context. So, they were going to the Philippines in a really tense moment politically. So there's all this correspondence about how to talk to the press, what sorts of events they're going to have to do so that they don't raise any concerns, like they're going to have to give medals at a swimming competition. So overseas, it was really logistically complicated, but it was all through these networks of civilian and veteran and soldier organizers sort of figuring out the landscape in each given place and what was going to be possible in terms of a show, a space, the content that should be included.
Could you talk a little bit about, as a theater historian, the difference between the US shows and how you're able to access those? So that's through, people's memories or from things that are written about it. And then the Pacific shows, which we actually have film of. Like how you think about those differences, because it must be a much different experience.
Yeah, that is I hadn't quite thought about it that way. That's a great question. But it's totally true. I mean, trying to reconstruct the tour as a whole relied heavily on newspaper coverage and then the correspondence from the later tour. But right, in terms of actually accessing what the performances were like, yeah, I don't have that for those earlier ones. What you're making me think about is the fact that I had this other really weird experience of talking to people because the show changed really significantly over the course of its domestic tour. And then it was pretty fixed when it went on its tour overseas. It was all the same people the whole time. They had the same crew the whole time. That was pretty set. And there was all that work to sort of lay it all out in advance. Obviously, there are things that came up. I have a footnote in the book where I say, I might be sometimes in correspondence, I can't be sure if what is proposed in correspondence ever actually came to pass. But even still, I feel like it's useful information to understand what the project was, even if I can't say with certainty that like X, Y, or Z happened, because it's not in, a newspaper article. But domestically, people had really different understandings of what had happened before they joined. So a lot of people I mostly didn't talk to people who were involved in the first show. I mostly talked to people who were involved starting later in the spring or who got involved really just for the tour overseas. So that too was this, I was constantly sort of navigating these different inputs and trying to figure out how they related to each other. And I also had to figure out when the people I was talking to were wrong, which is weird to say, but when actually somebody must be misremembering when or where something happened because all of the other evidence points in that direction.
This is a time period, of course, when the military is facing a lot of racial unrest. There's just a lot, the country as a whole, but also the military is facing racial unrest. It's a time when Jane Fonda is starting to think a lot more about women's issues and gender. So can you talk about how all of that informs how the show changes over time, especially before it goes overseas?
Yeah, it really changes so much. And I think it's a couple of different sort of primary influences. So the first show is an all-white cast except for the comedian and activist Dick Gregory, who performs alongside the group. And it's also an exclusively male cast, except for Fonda and Barbara Dane, who's a folk singer. And it's really the content is quite contained to the issue of the war, to military life, and sort of presumes, I think, like a white male audience. Now, predominantly, their audience is white and male, but not exclusively, certainly. And obviously, well, at least I am interested in how questions of class and militarism and all of that intersect with race and gender and all of that. But that happens sort of later for the show. But initially, it's really kind of targeting. It's politically narrow, and it's intentionally politically narrow because they are trying to make this argument that, we're not any crazy radical show. We're just entertainment. We're just an anti-war entertainment program. And I think for some people involved, that was a tactic. That was like a way of kind of pursuing publicity that wouldn't just write them off as, a radical project. I think for other folks, that is what the politics of this should be. We shouldn't be trying to talk about women. We shouldn't be trying to talk about race. We need to just focus on this one issue and not address this other stuff. And there's a back and forth around the first performance that for me is sort of the foreshadowing of how these issues are going to get raised later. When there's correspondence between one of the writers, Jules Pfeiffer, and a couple of women civilian organizers. And apparently they are writing to him because they heard that he wanted to include a sketch in the show that would involve Jane Fonda coming out dressed as one of those girls, I'm quoting, that Bob Hope always brings with him on tour, which means like a bikini, like Jane Fonda in a bikini. And this is not long after Barbarella. So that probably would have been super appealing to their audience. And the women organizers are like, this is not okay. We're going to cut the lights on you. And he writes back and he's like, look, I think it's parody. I don't know what you're so worked up about. And for me, this is such a key question. Can that be parody? What is that at the expense of? And is it legitimate to sort of pursue this anti-war politics through a kind of reliance on pre-existing ideas about the role of women in military entertainment. So that's the beginning, right? That question could even sort of, or that premise could even be proposed. And then I think at a certain point, Francine Parker gets involved, and this precipitates in many direct ways, as do some other interactions Fonda has with some women organizers during the domestic tour, sort of precipitates this kind of militant feminism in the group, which Fonda adopts and is certainly part of the politics of some of the new people they bring on board, including Robin Minkin, who I mentioned earlier. And so they start trying to figure out how to write material that absolutely retains its focus on the US service member or serviceman, but also starts to think through the relationships between militarism, between imperialism, between the sort of class dynamics of the draft and enlistment, and think that in relation to the experience of women, both in the military and not. So they end up with this central character in a new set of sketches called Kitty Mitty, who sort of, we see things through her eyes, which is a totally new thing in the show, sort of by the end of the summer. So it retains an emphasis in a way on, what is going to be the more common set of experiences among their sort of audience's demographic, but while trying to make those links. In terms of race, there is not quite the same really sharp turn, but there is a deliberate effort to diversify the cast, and that results in a lot of material that more directly, more explicitly reflects elements of the experience of a Black service member. So there's two new performers, Pamela Donegan and Rita Martinson, who, are introducing music and spoken word that really feels like it connects more directly with Black audience members. And then, and the other really critical thing about this is that when they go overseas, because of the militancy of Black service members, there's a number of contexts in which sort of access to Black soldiers to talk to them about their politics and their perspectives on the war relies on those Black cast members because of a sort of a Black militancy and nationalism. They want to talk to those Black cast members and not to the white cast members. There's also I found some sketches, some written sketches that to me feel like they relate to another movement of that period called Black Revolutionary Theater. These really sort of often very short, powerful performances that are addressing, issues of racial violence, racial oppression, white supremacy. And I found some written sketches. I have no idea if they were ever included in the show. There's no representation of them in the film. I asked people about them and no one knew or remembered. So there seems to have maybe been a way the content was reflecting that, but I cannot say for sure if they were actually performed.
We've been mentioning Fonda. Another important person in both the show and the film is Donald Sutherland, who just passed away recently. Could you talk a little bit about him and his role? He is the white guy, but he's able to play these really. He sometimes plays like the straight man in the skits. So could you talk a little bit about that?
So Donald Sutherland is there in the beginning. He's there through to the end. He seems to have gotten involved in supporting the GI movement a little bit before the FTA, and differing accounts will place him at the meeting of Fonda and Howard Levy when the idea was discussed. There's also plenty of times I've seen that meeting referred to without any reference to Donald Sutherland, but I feel like that kind of makes sense. Like that kind of seems to be his relationship to this project. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, I think he actually, if you look at descriptions of him as an actor, which I was doing recently after he passed, there's a real correspondence between the description of his acting and the way I think he related to the project of the FTA, which is this kind of, there's a term in theater called throwing focus, where you might be in the scene, but you're meant to be helping the audience pay attention to someone else or to something else that's happening. And that's a useful way of thinking about the FTA show generally, right? Like it was a performance, but it was also meant to sort of throw focus onto the GI movement for a civilian audience and even for the soldiers themselves. So I think in some ways, Sutherland's relationship to the show, the fact that he doesn't talk a lot in the film. He hasn't ever really talked about being in the FTA. Apparently, there's an unfinished autobiography, so I don't know if that will address that part of his life. But as I said, he was there in the beginning, he was there till the end. I mean, alone among the men who were there on that stage, at the opening performance, he sort of weathered that feminist reckoning. And I think that that's a really powerful testament to his investment in and support for the GI movement. He also had this one thing that he would always do at every performance. I think it literally happened at every performance that the FTA did, which I'm not sure there's anything else you can say that about. Maybe this sketch called Red in Red. And he had done this before his involvement in the FTA, when he had started participating in some civilian support actions for the GI movement, which is that he reads this passage from Dalton Trumbo's book, Johnny Got His Gun. And it's the final passage from the book. So just a very brief summary of that book is that there's a soldier in World War I who is in a bomb blast and he loses all of his limbs. He loses basically all of his face, his eyes, his ears, his tongue. And so he's lying in a hospital bed and he figures out he can communicate by tapping his head in Morse code. And what he wants to do and what he communicates to these military officials is that he wants his body to be put on display and toured around the world so people can see what war does. And he believes that will mean the end of all war. And he realizes that will never happen, that they won't. I mean, they say no, basically, right? And so in this final passage of the book, in first person, he basically says that if men in the future try to make us fight a war, we will turn the guns on them. I mean, it's this really beautiful, moving speech. And it's actually at the end of the FTA film, we see Sutherland perform some of it. And he had been reading this at Operation Rapid American Withdrawal, which was a VVAW action. And then he did it for every show. And it's often described in coverage of the show as this totally implausible, but deeply successful moment of sincerity and quiet in the midst of what is otherwise it's sometimes a kind of not hokey, but comedic, sketches, a little bit of slapstick, right? But somehow Sutherland could create this incredible weight in the middle of the performance. And I only just recently realized, which feels a little embarrassing as a researcher, that Sutherland was in the film adaptation of that book in 1968 or something, and plays Christ in the movie. And it's an amazing performance. I mean, it's totally devastating. But I just became really interested in the idea that Donald Sutherland encountered this book and encountered this speech, and he was like, you know what? I'm just going to keep doing this. I can do this. I'm going to keep doing it. And it's really effective. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about Donald Sutherland and really appreciating him and his role in the FTA.
At the end of the book, you start reflecting a little bit on what we can learn from the FTA and perhaps apply to today. Not that there's any political protest that needs to happen today. If you could just reflect on that a little bit now.
Yeah, it's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I think where I arrive at the end of the book, and I have to say, the conclusion of the book is, I really like it. It really it was where I figured out the thinking that the FTA had let me do. And a big part of the takeaway for me, and this is after spending a lot of time thinking about the discourse of acting as it sort of was attached to 1960s protest. And that's true of the GI activists who were sort of written off as not real soldiers. It's true of Fonda, who really, from both the left and the right, got a lot of grief for being an actor who was involved in political activism. Yes, the book let me think a lot about acting in relation to political protest. And I think the takeaway for me is that it can be really awkward and embarrassing to be an activist. It can feel like you are pretending that things are possible that aren't possible. A lot of times it can feel like, and I'm speaking from personal experience, it can feel like, or you can be afraid of being accused, that you are just sort of pretending you are in the past, right? Like you see it right now. You see it a lot right now. The Bill Maher comment about cosplay among students protesting and having the encampments about what Israel is doing in Gaza, saying it's cosplay that these students are wearing keffiyehs. That's exactly the rhetoric I'm talking about. Like there's no way engaging with the substance of what these students are saying or what they're doing or what is happening right now. It's saying you're faking it, right? Like you're pretending. And that's so much of the discourse during the 60s and the efforts to downplay the existence of the GI movement and to say that veterans who were taking a principled position against the war were like pretending, right? Like it's not even saying they're wrong. It's not even saying what they're saying isn't true. It's like, oh, they're not really entitled to take a position or to say anything because being an anti-war veteran means you're not really a real veteran. I mean, it's crazy. Like it can make you feel crazy. And we see the same thing in the sort of aftermath of the 60s. Like following the 60s, you get all this sort of discourse that wants to rewrite the 60s as just a bunch of people pretending or playing around. And we see that now too, especially from the right. I mean, this next project I'm working on, I'm really trying to think through the idea of the crisis actor, right? Which is, a term people might have heard used about student survivors of school shootings. Either they're totally just actors who are pretending they were there to pursue gun control, or they were really there, but there's something disingenuous about their activism, right? Like they're being opportunistic or something. So it's totally, we see it transparently on the right? This rhetoric of discrediting people by saying they're not the people who, like, they're not the people they say they are, basically. And we can also stretch it way back, right? Like, discourse around school integration, right? And these theories that the Black students trying to integrate a school were like bussed in from outside of town. It's like, even if they were, right, does that actually fundamentally discredit the project of integration? So there's just such a long history of this, and I see it so potently right now. And I think it's really insidious. And I'm also, I also feel like activists and sort of people kind of towards the left, I see sometimes a tendency to want to adopt some of that premise and like protect against it by appealing to ideas of authenticity. I think we see some of that in, right, like there is sort of sometimes this kind of self-policing of movements that I think isn't quite the answer, right? I think that if you are proposing the world can look different than it does, then you're undertaking like a super precarious project that is not totally unlike what actors do. And I think if we maybe can understand a little more clearly that dynamic, we might be less inclined to, I don't know, make ourselves smaller in response to like accusations that we're just pretending or it's not real, and instead be like, well, we're going to make it that way. Like this, this is the project. And so, yeah, I think I'm really in that final passage trying to say, yes, this can be weird and embarrassing and we can feel like we're pretending, but maybe that's what it is to try and argue that things should be different than they are.
This is a terrific book. We haven't even talked about any of the Hanoi Jane stuff, so please tell listeners how they can get a copy.
Yeah, great. Oh, and thank you so much. You can, I think it's like, if you Google it, you will find it. I know it's on bookshop.org, which is cool. You can also get it straight from NYU Press. And if you do that and you use the code NYUP30, you will get 30% off. And it's also available as an ebook, which I think is great. So it may be that if you tell your library to get it, they might. I just told my university library to get it, and they did. Yeah, I think generally accessible. You can read an excerpt on History News Network, and you can read a piece I wrote about Donald Sutherland's involvement on, of all places, foreignpolicy.com, Foreign Policy Magazine online. So, yeah, I think relatively accessible.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much. I loved learning about the FTA, and I'm so glad you spoke with me today.
Oh, I'm so glad too. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Nations are but race their future trouble. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode and a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!